Welcome and thank you for joining. This interview is part of a research article titled Ethical Risk of Generative AI in Education by Or Daniel and the advisor Dr. Rinat Rosenberg-Kima from the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. The availability of the interview along with the scientific article can benefit both the scientific and education communities. The interview content was not edited, only noise and pauses were removed. We thank all subject matter experts for contributing their knowledge and experience to this study. A link to the article and ways to contact us will be added to the information of this interview. Interview number 10, Professor Nir Eisikovits, held on December 1st, 2023 in English. Enjoy. Thank you again, Professor. Please state your name and elaborate, please, on your professional background and experience.
So my name is Nir Eisikovits. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and I direct the Applied Ethics Center there. I have a PhD in philosophy and a law degree, and I work on the ethics of technology and the ethics of conflict.
In your view, what are the potential benefits or advantages of using generative AI technologies in education?
One benefit is how engaging the technology is for users. So the human-like communication ability can make the use of technology and even the subject matter more accessible and more engaging for students. So as an interface, it's the most engaging interface in the history of technology. There's no doubt about that. And to the extent that you want your projects to engage students, it's helpful in that. Another potential benefit is the technology teaches people how to ask questions, which can be an important skill to have because you get different results depending on the quality of the query, the question that you put in. So it can provide good training in knowing what kind of questions to ask. A third kind of benefit is that it can serve as a kind of backup role or assistant to a teacher, namely the teacher, whether in a college setting or in a secondary setting, can provide some content, some instruction, and then send the kids to the chatbot for, further information or for solidifying what's been learned. So I'd say these are some of the main benefits.
Great, thank you. So what do you see as the main risk, challenges, or ethical concerns associated with educational uses of generative AI?
The most significant risk, and we've talked about this before in our podcast, the most significant risk is if on the most basic level, education is supposed to be about knowledge and about making people know more than they knew before the educational process. This is a technology that still is not capable, even on its 1-year birthday. It's a technology that is still not capable of distinguishing between truth and lies. It's not programmed and calibrated for distinguishing truth and lies. There's been an empirical, measurable improvement between, for example, ChatGPT 3 and 4. But ChatGPT 4 still makes plenty of mistakes and hallucinates plenty. So that's, both an ethical and a practical risk when it comes to generative AI and use in education. Number two, in time, this technology will eliminate the importance of writing in higher education because it writes instead of you, practically speaking. Writing is the best tool that we have so far for developing critical thinking. And that would be a big loss that we have not thought about or figured out how to fix and replace. Number three, and you can see this more in stuff like DALL-E and Midjourney, so in some of the sort of image generators, generative AI takes out the emphasis from the creative process and moves it to the creative result. So, for example, my daughter is in an art class right now in school, and they're teaching them how to draw. And the results aren't always great, but they're immersed in the process. They have this kind of flow and playful being in the process of doing it. It's hard to see how you sustain that in a world where most images and most artworks are going to move from a kind of laborious, long process of drafts and reiteration and doing again and again and little fixes to, almost like God in Genesis, that the world is created through saying the word, right? God said there was light, and then there was light. There's something of that nature in applications like Midjourney and DALL-E. And that's a very, very different idea of creativity. And so I think that's a real potential cost too.
Actually, in our past talks, you said about the truth, right? You said if one of the main reasons that it's education, or one of the main objectives, right, is teaching the truth. And then you mentioned also now the hallucination, and we do not know, the generative AI do not know if something is right or wrong, right? And I remember that talk really strongly because it's affect everything. So how... what I'm trying to ask is, that's a main risk, right? So how already I see it in education systems, teachers are teaching with the use of these tools in class?
Look, to some extent, it's irresponsible. If you accept the premise, which you just said, if you accept the assumption that the idea behind education is to teach the truth, you should be very careful, conservative, and slow in using a tool that isn't calibrated for telling the difference between truth and lies. I think many of us have an excitement with technology for the sake of newness rather than for the sake of usefulness. It's just human nature. We're excited about new things because we're curious creatures. I think it also combines with the kind of structural stresses and pressures there are on teachers, that every technological tool that can make their life easier, they're going to try to use. Very specifically and very practically, at the minimum, I think that if teachers are going to use generative AI, somebody needs to pay for and supervise the guardrails around the generative AI. It's pretty simple. If you're a commercial company and you're going to use generative AI for therapeutic purposes, like if you're one of these new AI therapy companies, for example, if you don't have very, very strong guardrails that make sure that the chatbot doesn't give false information, dangerous information that would make people do the wrong thing, that would be bad for their health. So any kind of e-health application that's based on generative AI, if it's not profoundly, strongly, reliably guardrailed, you'd go out of business and you'd get sued. At a minimum, when you're dealing with young people's education, the same standard should apply. So if it's going to be used, it has to be guardrailed. If it's not guardrailed, it shouldn't be used. And if you ask me, it shouldn't be used at all for now. It has potential, or it can be used together with the teacher in class in a kind of, I use it in my classes, but I use it when I'm there. I use it as a way, for example, part of critical thinking, for example, is learning how to ask questions, not only learning how to write. It's a great tool for that. I use it with my students to compare what quality of information they get from traditional research and search on databases, and what kind of quality of data they get on interaction on a chatbot. But that's supervised, structured use. That's very different from letting kids sort of go off into the wild with it.
So what recommendation would you have for policymakers regarding regulating or providing guidance on generative AI in education?
So derived from this exchange that we just had, at the minimum, necessitating and paying for guardrailing of generative AI in education. Number two, Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, whether that's done at the school level or whether that's done at the sort of original development level is a different kind of question. But there needs to be funding that goes into the guardrailing of AI on university and school level. So for example, public schools and public universities need to have, if they are going to use this kind of technology, need to have funds for making sure that the technology is safe for learning.
But you mentioned also about the development of critical thinking. You also said an example with your daughter about developing the way she paints, right? Or creativity.
Right, draws,
yeah. You wouldn't want to suggest more regulation maybe about using AI? Again, with your examples that you already mentioned.
What kind of regulation do you have? I mean, my main concern with it is this question of hallucination. The question of de-skilling is a sort of, in some way, a deeper concern. I mean, to some extent, I'm kind of influenced in my answers by, what I know is realistic and what I don't think is realistic. If I was a principal of a school, and some schools do this here, I would, in large part of the day, not let kids use any technology just because of the kind of data that's being gathered about its focus on the fragmentation of attention and the fragmentation of concentration. Our brains are not built for the kind of multitasking that the technology and the shift in attention, the constant shift in attention, that allowing technology like that in the classroom brings in. So I'm not convinced that, there used to be this whole trend of like, get everybody an iPad, get everybody a Chromebook, and schools are starting to sort of move away from that because the benefits didn't play out. So my own sense is actually that you should severely limit the amount of technology in general being used in schools, not just generative AI, specifically generative AI, because it has risks on top of the usual attention risks that technology has, namely the risks of learning untrue information and the risks of undoing your critical thinking. I don't think, especially in a place like the United States, where policy making is so profoundly influenced by lobbying and the financial interests of stakeholders, I don't think that's going to happen. So I gave you the sort of minimum version of regulation that I think makes sense. If I was running a private school, for example, I would ban technology for large parts of the day. I would collect phones in the entrance to class and put them in a basket. I would teach people to write again and ask them most of the time, unless it's necessary for the subject matter of the class, not to be on their laptop unless they absolutely have to be. And interestingly, just before you kind of think that I'm a 19th century Luddite, more and more schools are doing that. And actually doing that more and more is considered to be the hallmark of an elite education, which is interesting.
Wow.
So what you took for granted as sort of normal human interaction, namely you and I talking to each other in a class around a book or around a piece of music or around a piece of art, is now becoming the kind of more restricted elite version of education.
Dead Poet Society, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, basically. Basically.
So I think you answered the next question somehow, but I will still ask. Maybe you have something to add, probably. What suggestions would you have for educators and or administrators in education that looking to integrate generative AI into curricula or institutions?
Yeah, so, combination of the previous two answers that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
If it's going to be used, it should be used in a structured, supervised kind of way. It can be integrated into assignments, but then the assignments have to somehow be about, what you get out of the use of the technology. So you can't just sort of keep your old way of assignments and say you're allowed to do, whatever you want. You can't just say, write me a paper like you wrote me a paper before, and all bets are off. You can use anything you want. Instead, you have to say something like, give me a handwritten version of the paper and give me a ChatGPT version of the paper, and then give me a third paper that compares the strengths and weaknesses of each one of those. And then you can learn something from that process. Or you could say, if you want to have a debate about the death penalty, for example, have a debate with ChatGPT about, the death penalty, and print out the transcript of the debate for me, and then write a short paper about whose positions were more compelling. Something along those lines. So you can integrate it. The problem is if you have a debate with ChatGPT about the death penalty and ask it to document and source its answers, often the sources will be made up.
Yeah.
So yesterday, for example, I recommended to a friend that he send an op-ed article that he wrote to several newspapers. And he didn't have, and I said, you have to send this to the op-ed editors, the opinion editors of major newspapers. And I told him which newspapers to send it to. And he's like, okay. And he went to ChatGPT and said, who are the op-ed editors of the 10 largest newspapers in America, and what are their emails? And he got an amazing answer, and 8 out of the 10 emails were made up. And this is ChatGPT 4. So it's, in a way, he wasted his time. And you could see how similar assignments would have similar results with students, and they would be wasting your time and their time. So you can integrate, in other words, you can integrate ChatGPT into assignments. Sometimes you could even benefit from it. Given the very difficult hallucination problem, I'm not sure if it just wouldn't be a more efficient use of your time to just do a traditional assignment.
So in your opinion, under what circumstances is the use of generative AI in education setting appropriate and ethically acceptable, and when would it be inappropriate or unethical?
Yeah, ethically acceptable for methodological purposes right now. So, for example, learning how to ask questions where you don't emphasize the validity of the answers, but rather the structural capacity to ask questions. It would be appropriate in comparing modes of research and modes of thinking. So as, please research whether the European idea or the American idea about classifying nuclear energy as green energy is better. And all goes to ChatGPT, but all also goes to a series of traditional databases and produces 2 papers, one on the basis of database research, one on the basis of ChatGPT research. What's the difference between those answers, right? So that's what I mean by a methodological purpose. So at least you learn the kind of differences in the answers that these 2 things generate. I could see other uses, for example, like art history uses. Again, if it's very, very supervised, make me an image in the Impressionist tradition and the Cubist tradition, the same image, and you can get a certain kind of idea of the difference between those 2 genres, with the knowledge that the answer would be based on what the aggregate internet thinks about the difference between those 2 genres, which is not always true. So, again, for teachers who are pressed in time, I think it can have some benefits. It's structurally a limited kind of creativity in the end. If you think that teachers should be creative in the classroom, relying on the creativity of generative AI has inherent limitations, but yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, maybe I'm asking it again, but can you give 1 or 2 examples on inappropriate or unethical?
Giving people a traditional paper assignment, and sort of not worrying too much how they do it. asking people to learn by themselves about a topic from ChatGPT, asking people to have a conversation by themselves about an important topic with ChatGPT. All of these are both unsafe and not anchored to knowledge and truth.
So you're actually saying that even a simple chat, right, with a ChatGPT of a child is not responsible, or it's not ethical?
Not responsible. I would not do it for a million years with my own child as part of the education process. I might do it when I'm sitting there to show them that it can produce deeply problematic results.
In your opinion, how should educators and policymakers assess the risk associated with generative AI? And I'm actually asking it, for example, if I'm an educator, right, and I want to assess some kind of risk before entering a technology to the classroom. So how can I do that about generative AI?
You don't need to assess anything. You just shouldn't use a technology that can't speak the truth freely. I mean, when the burden of proof, chovat hochacha in Hebrew, the burden of proof that the technology is connected to facts and truth should be on the companies that make it. And if they can't produce compelling evidence that the technology can track truth reliably, it should be assumed to be suspect. You shouldn't, because the whole idea of assessment, it's not reliable. So on different days, it can have different levels of accuracy. Let me ask you a question though. You have a young kid who's 6 or 7 years old, right? If I told you tomorrow, your kid is, and I assume you care about, what he gets at school. If I told you tomorrow, your kid is going to school and it's going to be a random generated result, whether the teacher is full of shit or speaks the truth to his class. Would you think that it's, a good educational environment for them? Would you want to, and I tell you, this is just a fact about the teacher. It's a throw of the dice, a random generated result about whether the teacher is going to be accurate tomorrow or not. And now let's assess these teachers. You know what I mean? The project of assessment, you would say, I don't want to assess the teacher. I don't want the teacher.
Yeah.
I would only want to assess a teacher that is accurate 100% of the time, and then I assess if it's a good teacher. But I don't even want to go to assessment, is my point. Because by going to assessment, you legitimate the project. A technology that is not accurate and doesn't care if it's accurate shouldn't get the legitimation of being assessed in the first place.
Wow.
That's what it means to take accuracy seriously.
Wow.
You would want that teacher fired tomorrow if half the time they were bullshitting. And I'm sorry for using that language, but that's technically what this technology is doing. When somebody doesn't care about the difference between truth and lies, then by definition, philosophically, technically, they're bullshitting. If you had a bullshitting teacher, you wouldn't want them to be part of your child's education. So why would you want the bullshitting technology to be part of your child's education to be assessed? And it's still a bullshitting technology.
Well, so I really love the analogy. I still amazed by it, and I think I will use it if you will allow me. Also, that's amazing analogy. So it's actually like a
thought experiment. Yeah.
So when you think about it, it's actually if we do the same exercise for DALL-E, Midjourney as a test, right? What are the benefits for it, and what can we produce from it? But text, text chat like ChatGPT, it's a bit different, is what you said. But when I think about Midjourney, for example, it does something else, right?
Yeah.
It's bringing you a way. When you think about it, it brings you a way to live again, or to try yourself, reinvent or create a new way of creation of a Picasso, right?
Yeah.
A new twist to Picasso or something. So maybe the same experiment on text to image is a bit different, because we know it's not Picasso, right? But
yeah. Look, I mean, yes, you're right. Using it in an art class is different than using it in a history class. But even using it in an art class, and here you'd probably have to talk to artists to get a fuller answer. Even using it in an art class, look, the technology de-emphasizes process for results.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And art emphasizes process over results. Are you still teaching art when you're teaching it through a technology that de-emphasizes process for results?
That's a good question.
It's not as, if you will, black and white strict an answer as earlier. But again, I invite you to consider the thought experiment and the analogy with your child. If you wanted...
Yeah, but when I'm trying...
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Professor. When I'm trying to do the same thought experiment in my head, as you've done with the ChatGPT, now, you know, in this talk, first of all, it's really fun. The second thing is it's correlated to what you said also in one of your previous answers about de-skilling, right? Because I can generate really fast a Picasso, so it's focused on the result, right? But if I want to try it and doing it myself and learn exactly the process and how this art is creation, you know, and not only Picasso, clay, right, and every other thing that I can create with my hands, that the machine just copy and do some kind of a twist. It's the focus on the result and not on the process. And learning emphasize the process always, right? And we learn more from our mistakes, right? That's also, yeah.
And you wouldn't make as many mistakes. You would make mistakes in prompting, but it's different to make mistakes in prompting and mistakes in the process of creating something. Again, I mean, look, even if we abstract and bracket and put aside the question of truth and lies for a moment, this technology emphasizes having an idea and getting the results of the idea. And that is a impoverished and problematic idea of creativity, because I have a lot of ideas every day, and I'm very proud of myself for my ideas. When I try to write them down and realize them, in the process of writing them down and realizing them, and for example, making an argument of them, 99% of them turn out to be nonsense and bad and not reliable. And one of them turns out to be a good idea. And I would only know that it's a good idea through the process of iterating it and writing it out. That's, you know, I write for a living. So in that example, what it would mean to move from an idea to a product is have the process of making an outline, writing it out, etc., etc., etc. You had the idea for this very interesting study you're doing for your dissertation. The process is you had to go find all the experts you wanted to talk to. You had to talk to them for an hour each, like you're talking to me. Then you had to sit down with the recordings and figure it out. And then you had to say, well, Nir gave me these 4 answers, and there was a contradiction between what he said in answer 1 and answer 4. And here's the difference between what he said and the articles he wrote. And here's how what he said relates to what the other 3 said. And here's how he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he does know what he's talking about. And at the end of this, a dissertation will be generated after a very laborious process. And hopefully, the value of that dissertation, hopefully, I'm sure it will, knowing you, the value of the dissertation will derive from the fact that the process was laborious. The idea of generative AI is to jump from the first stage in that to the last stage in that. Now, based on the quality of the data, sometimes that could be based on the quality of the training data, sometimes that might even work. But on the human level, a great deal is lost in the process. And I think that's true about art as well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's even more true about art. You know, I mean, yeah, you could ask yourself, what's the most valuable part of an artist's work? Is it the hanging of the final piece in the museum, or is it the road that it took to get to the final piece?
Actually, that's also interesting. Yeah. Well, sometimes people from the I don't know a lot, but I know that people are actually paying for the story also, not only for the final product.
Yeah.
So, Professor, do you have any other perspectives you would like to share regarding the ethics of generative AI in education? Maybe this is something that we didn't talk about.
You know, just to reemphasize the last point, there's a difference which we tend to miss between the fact that something is new and shiny and that something is good, and that there's good reasons to be, you know, I've found it puzzling for a long time. So first of all, that's its own point. The fact that something is new and exciting doesn't make it good yet. Nuclear weapons are also new and exciting. Not that generative AI is as dangerous as nuclear weapons, just that point, right? The second thing that I've always found puzzling is, you know, everybody says almost as a cliche that their children are the most important thing in the world to them. How we act about our children doesn't always support that statement. If your children are the most important thing in the world to you, wouldn't you want to be very, very careful about how they're educated, for example? Wouldn't you sort of be very careful? If our children are the most important thing in the world to us, why are we like subjecting them to this gigantic scale 15-year experiment now with some of the most addictive technology ever invented? So just the second point is, you know, think about what it means to take your children seriously and their education seriously. I think simply embracing every new educational technology that a commercial company with interests in making money puts out is not necessarily the best way to take your children's education seriously. Within a year that this thing came out, everybody is thinking, well, it's completely inevitable to use it, right? That's not obvious to me at all. You know the pharmaceutical world, for example. That's not how people proceed with medications. Mm-hmm. But in some way, this is as important to the future lives of these kids as medications. So why aren't we more careful?
Oh, okay. That's amazing, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah.
So just one last thing. Do you approve this recording will be available for and accessible for everyone? Of course, in regard to the article.
Sure.
With a link to it.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Professor. So I will stop the recording.